and McLean. Dick Coach's Corner.
You're listening to the Rugby Coaches Corner podcast with your host, Andy Plimer.
For someone to explain.
Bringing you up-to-date coaching concepts from the world of rugby.
The distinction between these mandatory.
Sharing ideas to make the game better.
Welcome to episode number 42 of the Rugby Coaches Corner podcast. I'm your host, Andy Plimer, and joining me today is Nick Hill. Nick is a former professional player of 9 years with the Northampton Saints, Exeter Chiefs, Bedford Blues and Nuneaton, and also represented England U19 in the 1999 Junior World Cup. Being a rugby coach for 17 years and a PE teacher for 15, Nick has worked in schools and clubs where he has coached players from 8 years old through to 58 years old in both the Northern and Southern Hemisphere. It's a pleasure to have him on the show, so welcome, Nick.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, no worries. So we briefly touched on your playing and coaching career. Can you go into a bit more details on both those areas?
It first started off in my junior rugby club, aged 5 years old, when I just tagged along with my older brother.
Yep.
And played, went through the age groups. You got the local dad coaching you for numerous years, and then the secondary school I went to had a rugby program, and I was very lucky that two of my PE teachers were, you could call them at the time, professional rugby players. It wasn't professional back then. One was the Northampton Saints fly half, and the other guy was the hooker, John Olver, and he was the captain of the team at the time. And the year I joined that school, he would be playing for England in the 1991 World Cup.
All right, awesome.
So just timing really, and so I went through school, played a bit of again club and school at the same time. Basically doing sport 7 days a week. And then as got older and older, I got on the rep teams, local rep teams under 14 and 15 and things like that. And through that, got scouted by Northampton Saints and invited to training as a 16-year-old. And training with 19-year-olds, it was a massive learning curve. So that kind of laid the foundations to then, as you mentioned, I play for England under 19 and the Saints second team, academy, all the teams, captain various age groups through there. And then combined my study and my teaching career alongside playing at the same time. So that's kind of my playing background.
And when did you first dip your toe in the water for coaching?
I suppose that seed was sown when I was going to secondary school, aged 11, with the inspiration of my two teachers. I said, I want to be a PE teacher. And then professional rugby came along and then said, I'd love to be, head of a rugby program in a school. So just went back to my old school to start with, during university, just to, put my hands in coaching. So that was like part-time, and then started off teaching, just general PE and science teaching, cover teaching, and then I actually got a job back at my old school as head of the rugby program, and I did that for a couple of years. Basically, it was an apprenticeship. Just learning all the ropes, the different areas of the job. And then you could call it a promotion to Dunstan College. They were looking for a director of rugby because their rugby program needed a bit of a kick. And so, applied and got the job, and I was there for 8 years. I was very lucky. The headmaster gave me a clean slate, basically, to create a philosophy and an approach. And, the support of the teachers in the school and the parents and the governors. Had a great 8 years there, and I took it as far as I could. Throughout that process, I did some rep team coaching, under 14 to under 18, and various head coach roles, assistant roles. To keep myself in like the talent development aspect, and then just needed a new challenge out of my comfort zone. So that's how I through attending a conference, I spoke with someone, and then next thing I know, I was on a plane out to Chile. So
it's quite the challenge there. So what's a bit of a description with your role there in Chile, and also for those not familiar with the Chilean rugby landscape, what's a bit of an idea on where the main centres are and those kind of things?
Yeah, so I came across it, employed by a school as head of rugby, and I was a PE teacher at the same time. At the same time, I started coaching the kids in the club. The school and the club are directly linked. As time went on. The last 4 years, I then coached in the club with the adult teams in the top division of the Chile league here. So as you mentioned in the beginning, I coached kids from 8-year-olds up to 18 in the school, and then the adults in the club. And the landscape here in Chile, there's rugby pretty much the whole length of the country, where there's any towns and things, and mixture of schools and clubs, with Santiago being the main area.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's pockets in Antofagasta in the far north, Viña in the west by the coast, and then down south, 2 towns of Concepcion and Temuco. So they're like the main, satellite areas of where rugby happens in the country.
Right.
With Santiago being the strongest area. And in essence, that's where the Premier Division here in Chile runs, with around 12 to 16 clubs, depending.
Okay.
It's up to 16 clubs now. Basically, it splits the competition into 2 leagues. You play in your league, and then you qualify for the top 8, so the top 4 of each side of the draw.
Mm-hmm.
You play the top 8, and then there's semi-final and finals to decide who the club champions are each year. Then there's, overall there's plenty of potential in the country, and there's a good tradition going back to 1920s when various schools started playing rugby. So.
Mm-hmm. All right, sounds awesome. Sounds like it'd be a really cool part of the world to live in. Okay, so I got you on the show for some of the stuff that you put out on your website, and I'll put the link to that on the show notes, and also some of the stuff you tweet. You do a lot of work with teaching games for understanding, also known as TGfU. Can you give us a bit of a background on what teaching games for understanding are, and why coaches should maybe consider having a look at this philosophy?
Sure. If you were to read the textbooks, it's basically a theoretical model that moves in a constant cycle, really, where you start with a game, then it moves around game appreciation, tactical awareness, making appropriate decisions, skill execution, and performance. And basically, it teaches the why first, the what to do, when to do it, not just how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also a part of the player-centered coaching philosophy approach by Lynn Kidman, who's very, I'd call her one of the experts in player-centered coaching.
Absolutely.
With Rod Thorpe and David Bunker from Loughborough University being the founding fathers of the approach in the early 1980s, where they saw a traditional method that produced skillful players but poor games players. In essence, you focus on the game as a whole instead of breaking it up into fundamental skills and techniques. And one way I put it across in simplest terms, you start with a game, not end with a game.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, you see that a lot. Like I see it every weekend with my daughter. She's 6 years old and she plays ringette, which is kind of like ice hockey, but with a stick and a ring on the ice. And, she's on the ice for 50 minutes, and the last 10 minutes of that is a game at the end. And it drives me bananas because you see how much learning takes place in that 10 minutes compared to, the 40 minutes earlier where they're skating around cones and passing to imaginary people and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, so I couldn't agree with you more on that. And what are some of your personal favourites that you like to call on when you're coaching this way?
It's after an athletic development dynamic warm up, pretty much get the game up and running. Depending how many players, 15v15 or 10v10.
Yep.
Some basic rules up. Basically around the breakdown area, for example, when a guy gets tackled is a grab. I use, and 2 guys over, 2 on the floor, and just play. And I just referee that for those basic rules for 5 minutes. So the game just evolves and develops. In terms of some of my favourite examples, in particular, like the younger kids of understanding how to work on running hard and fast into space. When there's a breakdown, I would say, all the players come in and touch the ruck.
Yeah.
And you go and, tackle, grab, the attackers. Or everyone has to run out and touch the try line.
Yeah.
So you make obvious where the space is for the kids to run into. And then as those kids get more developed in that aspect, or older players, I'll just pair up two defenders together in the defensive line. So we still have the same formation around the breakdown, two down, two guards. But if you're in the D line, you're paired up with someone. So again, that just naturally creates more space between players. And then with, again, more challenging aspect, the defensive team splitting them into two different colour bibs. And say it's red and blue bibs.
Yep.
If the red team grab or tackle the guy, the rest of that red team run back to the try line.
Oh, great.
And so therefore, that's in the D line of the blue players.
Mm-hmm. And
in essence, you find that the two colours alternate each time who's making the tackle and the grab, who's in the D line, who's running back. That's one of my favourite aspects of working on that principle of hard and fast into space.
Yeah, I think you hear a lot of the academics talk about this, and they mention creating a decision-rich environment. And I can just picture that last one that you explained there, where every situation that the players are seeing is completely different. And they have to self-organise and create solutions and trial and error these things, just exactly how you do in a rugby game.
Yeah, because the players sometimes in the D line, the guys running back, they're out wide.
Mm.
A couple of phases later, the defenders are naturally in the middle. So, it's constantly changing pretty much every phase, the picture, the attack scene.
Yeah, and you also get some game-specific fitness benefits as well out of those situations too.
That's, going back to like why using this approach, it's working on fitness at the same time. And I find that the players then enjoy it more. They feel like they've had a workout.
Yeah.
And it's proven to increase intrinsic motivation. And then going back to the example with your daughter ice hockey, and I've seen it here in Chile with the hockey and football and things, it removes the question, when can we play a game?
Yeah, exactly. The whole thing is a game. Yeah.
That's all kids and players want to do is play games. And so it gets everyone active and engaged. You're learning about skills in the context of the game rather than separate from it.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier on Lynn Kidman and her book, Athlete-Centered Coaching, Developing Decision Makers. It's just outstanding, and it's up on my website just as a link for coaches if they want to try and track down that resource, and I highly recommend it to people. Was that one of your first introductions to TGfU, or was that you just came across that as part of the journey?
It was part of the journey along the way. But in essence, it was like the first book in this field. I've read all her books now, and I've read some of the game sense books of Richard Light, which, in my opinion, they're basically the same thing, but there's slight different technicalities. For example, teaching games for understanding is, the kids are trying to learn how to play the game. Mm-hmm. In a rugby context, quite often the kids already know the game, so you're working on their tactics, and that's kind of where game sense principles come in. But my beginning journey of this started, when I was involved in the England under-19 team, and Brian Ashton was my rugby coach.
Oh, awesome!
Who's a big fan of this approach. Mm-hmm. And as I moved into my coaching and teaching, he just helped England win the World Cup in 2003. He wasn't technically one of the World Cup coaching team, but the years before that, he was one of Sir Clyde's assistants. Mm-hmm. And he, after the World Cup, went to various conferences and seminars. And so having been coached by him and then see him explain it, I had a great foundation in that approach. And also coincided in the early 2000s when this games-based approach was, coming to the fore in rugby coaching. So there's a variety of ingredients that helped me get to where I am now and how I use the approach.
All right, moving on then. On your website, you mentioned that you like to use the principles of play for rugby for a lot of your sessions. Quick little test here. For you, what are the principles of play for rugby? And also, why would you recommend that coaches use that in terms of a guideline for some of their sessions?
It's a great question, because if you have to read certain national governing bodies textbooks, they have their certain list, and what I've noticed, it's kind of the same all the way around the world.
Right.
And my principles are different to those principles, but in one sense, you could probably say they're the same thing. Mm-hmm. I just come at it from a different viewpoint.
Yeah.
In the sense, for example, principles of attack, I ask the question, what is the objective in attack? Which, in my opinion, it's to score tries.
Tries, absolutely, yeah.
That's the number one. And therefore, the next question, whether it's trying to teach a coach or coach players is, okay, how do you score those tries? And for me, the first logical step of the process is you've got to run into space. Because if you run at a player, he's going to tackle you.
And you're not going to score that try.
Yeah, he's going to stop you scoring. And that's the number one objective in defence. You're trying to stop me scoring. And the second step in that defensive question is, how do you stop the team scoring? Well, for me, you form a line across the field. What does that line then do? It goes up, the team starts to pass it, so then you go out, you drift. And then when you get close to the ball carrier, you make a tackle. So in essence, they're my 4 fundamental principles in defence. Going back to the attack, obviously you're trying to score. How do you do that? Run into space. Okay, the opposition are trying to tackle you. You get tackled. The next principle that I have then is keep going the same way. So if you have a line across the field and you keep going the same way, eventually, in principle, they will run out of defenders. They don't keep going far side and reorganising. What helps with that then as well, at the same time, you have players out wide. Because if you have a narrow attack, the defenders will line up against you. It closes the space. So then you have players in the wide channels, whether it's the 5-metre channel or 15-metre channels, depends on age and type of competition and stuff. But have width. What does that naturally do? That spreads out the defence. Now, if they spread out, you then go through the space in the middle. They come and tackle you. Now the space is that wide. So it's like a constant dynamic change between the different scenarios you have. So they're my basic 4 attack principles.
Yeah, that's interesting the way you've done that, because I think any coach who's done any of their levels has answered those questions about what are the 6 principles of play, and you're looking at it in a different way, where you've stripped it down to 4 attack, 4 defence. Do you find that's a way that provides clarity to players, whether it be on the practice field or in the classroom?
Yeah, definitely, and that's. You mentioned the word clarity. That's exactly what came into my head when you started to talk just then. And because when you're in the heat of the moment, you want to go back to your default thing. And if it's clear and concise and simple, it's very easy to remember. It's very easy to put it into practice. And for me, that's what you break the game down to in those 2 sides of attack and defence. It comes down to those simple key things, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's cool. And what have you had in terms of success with using this approach? I noticed on your website as well, you talk about your time at Denstone College there, and you were able to turn around the performance of the program there. Was this involved a lot in that process? So
during that experience and that time at Denstone over 8 years, I started to, towards the end of it, in 2012, through Wayne Smith, understand how you research try scoring trends.
Yeah.
And I then got into a little bit more specific of almost like sub principles below those 2 aspects that then help you score tries and help stop tries. And in defence, for me, those 2 sub principles are, in essence, having a sweeper, which in essence is that normally most people have a scrum half and 9, like 5 metres behind the D line.
Yep.
And I never called it a sweeper before I came to Chile. It was one of the 16-year-old kids I was coaching. I was trying to explain it in the best I can. The kids have good English understanding, and he just described the word sweeper.
Yeah.
And so then, if you think of that concept of painting an image to what the words, so I have a sweeper behind the D line. And then I'm sure most people out there have a pendulum back 3 defence system that goes side to side behind that in case there's any errors. So through that research project, I've found those 2 very important. And then on the attacking side of sidestepping and offloading skills are crucial to helping you get into that space and score the tries.
Absolutely.
And pretty much every try has passing in it. So they're the 3 sub-principles in attack. And over my time at Denstone, where I had very lucky to have a clean slate and take it where I wanted to, I saw the vision going. And for the first 4 years, in essence, I coached across the whole school, from the 12-year-olds to the 18, really fine-tuning those principles and developing my condition games, as I call them.
Mm-hmm.
And for the first 4 years, I kind of helped the coaching team in the first team, which is the under-18s. And then from 2009, I headed up the coaching team. And by applying these principles and games understanding, teaching in a classroom environment using videos and understanding, as well as physically doing the game, it had a big turnaround in performance. In the period 2005 to 2008, the first team played 53 matches against a variety of schools, and the average tries for per game was 2.5, and tries conceded was 3.4 tries per game.
Not the best.
No. And it was something like a 20% win percentage.
Yeah.
And during that 4 years, I was teaching the younger kids and coaching them and getting them to understand the philosophy and the approach. So when these players started to move into the first team environment, over a 4-year period, in 10 less games, the team scored 41 more tries.
Oh, nice.
And they conceded 135 less tries.
Oh, wow. That's great.
Which turned around the average tries per game from 2.5 to 4.0, a significant improvement, and then decreased tries again from 3.4 to 1.1.
Ah, that's excellent. Yeah.
So across a 4-year period, we conceded on average 1 try per game. And applying those principles that I've developed and learned through a variety of sources, it had a major impact on the success of the program, and the fixture list got tougher, and the performances got really much better.
Yeah, that's great, and that's a great little case study, and I think for coaches who are starting up a new role, provides a lot of guidance in terms of, setting out what happened before and what's happening now, and you can really pick up some road signs along the way. And when you reflect back on it, you can assess what your techniques were like and whether they were working or not, and that can help your coaching as well.
Most definitely, and like you say, the reflective coaching is where you're looking at how you did things and how you can get things better and improve on it. It's definitely an excellent part of the coaching process.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think as coaches in general, we're usually really good at the planning side of things. We have an idea on what we're going to do and what we want to achieve from our session. But then that follow-up at the end, that review and that time to reflect on the session, I know personally that I've had to put some systems in place to make sure that happens.
Yeah, and that's definitely one skill I've improved here in Chile. I kind of made it a thing when I was in the club coaching the adults on a Tuesday and Thursday nights. Before I got in the car to come home, I would sit down and reflect on what can we do better, or what do we need to work on in training each week, and that process, that cycle again helped improve performance significantly here in Chile as well with the adults in the top division.
Yeah, and I've gotten to a place where I use my iPhone a lot with memos in the calendar, where I'll put in a memo after every session that I know I'm coaching. It'll be a reminder to prompt me to do my review, which I've created a form via Google Docs, and I'll put in my review in that form, and then I'll have another memo pop up before my next session to remind me to go and look at that review and make adjustments moving forward. And I think it's crucial to go through a process like that to get better.
Definitely, and you have to be you put in place there a disciplined approach. Otherwise, if you leave it a few days, you don't quite remember as much, or you've forgotten some things that you had fresh in your mind. And I can recommend to coaches out there, the sooner you can do it, the closer to when you did the coaching session, the better reflection you make, and the knowledge and things you have of that session are very, very clear.
All right, so moving on there, giving your website quite a plug this interview, but there's a quote on there that says something along the lines of thinking differently about the way you see the game, and you're obviously someone who enjoys doing that. At the time of recording this, we're coming off a pretty fascinating match between Italy and England in the Six Nations, and there was obviously some great thinking there in terms of strategy on Italy's behalf. It's quite a polarizing issue. You either loved it or you hated it. I'm definitely in the love it category. We're talking about not contesting the ruck, therefore creating no offside line because there's only a tackle. What just from that episode that we saw, what do you think some lessons are there from a coaching standpoint, both for the team doing that strategy and the team being on the receiving end of it? Because we saw that England took a good 30-40 minutes to adjust to that.
The number one thing I would say is making sure all your players know the laws of the game. Because it was quite fascinating. It's going around social media at the moment. Is the moment James Haskell asked, "What is the rule of the ruck?" And the fact that James Haskell's using the word "rule,"
that's a problem.
And it's a law book.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of tongue in cheek there. Of, make sure your players know the exact laws of the game in areas that will affect the actual flow of the game. Then it's to make sure not only have you got kind of plan A, B, and C, it's almost like plan Z. Way left field, that every now and again a coach has identified something in your game. Certainly in competitions and places where people review their opposition teams and things. Which therefore then you'll need as a coach is to develop self-reliant players who can make tactical decisions on the move in high-pressure situations. Because for me, in those moments in that first half, it became quite evident that England needed to pick and go right from the ruck.
Yeah.
Rather than pass it, which they quite often do, pick and go straight away. Lying on the floor, pop it straight up. So in essence, there are no rucks. In a faster way, whereas if the guys fall over and 3 players go over and hover there, you're wasting time. So it's England almost literally needs 0-second rucks to keep the game flowing. And for me, tactically, it was either pick and go or offload out the tackles on the ground or in midair. So they're the 3 key things straight away that you can come up with. And I suppose the next question following on is then, what do you need to do to provide that environment so players can do those decisions?
Yeah, and that's the fascinating part for me is just watching that first half and to see how much England obviously hadn't experienced this before and had clearly never been there or never simulated something like this. And it wasn't until they went off at half time that they came back and had made the necessary adjustments. I think we saw Courtney Laws do a really good pick and go from the base of a non-existent ruck, and I found that whole process really, really interesting.
Yeah, and like you mentioned in that second half, they did offload, they did pick and go, and they scored tries quite quickly, and they were beautiful tries in both corners of the field. And so it's you describe in essence it was the halftime team talk that they were able to change it. So from a coaching aspect, how can you develop and provide those opportunities in a coaching setting? So, for example, quite often there's a guy that gets injured and is on the floor for a minute. In like the real match on a Saturday, that happened a few times. So what do you facilitate your players to do in those huddles in training so they can come up with the plans to say rules or conditions you put in a game that gets them to think. So it's, I've written here that, decision making is a skill that needs teaching, it needs training, and it needs coaching.
Yeah.
If they don't do it in training, they're never going to be able to do it in a game. And that's the key question as a coach is how do you develop that in your sessions?
Yeah, it just added to the Six Nations this year. I just thought it was fantastic. The quality of rugby was amazing, and O'Shea and Venter, hats off to those coaches for coming up with that strategy. I feel it was they obviously saw it was the one way to keep them in the game, and they did it so well. And I just think it was fantastic. Okay, moving on then. When you're coaching, what's your favourite part of the game to coach, and why do you enjoy it so much?
My favourite part of the game to coach would be counter-attack. Yep. Really been fascinated with it the last few years, which comes from the background of using a games-based approach. More recently with the try-scoring trends research I've done, For example, I'm up to over 3,000 tries now across various levels of the game, club, provincial and international, both hemispheres, and 42% of tries are scored from counter-attack opportunities where you get the ball from the opposition ball. So that's quite a fundamental fact in the game. So most tries are scored from counter-attack. So I believe that most of your training time should be used counter-attack training.
So is that counter-attack from turnovers as well, or counter-attack solely by kicks?
It's kicks, knock-ons, interceptions, breakdown tackles, line-out scrums.
Yep.
That's that 42%. The big chunk of that 42% comes from kickbacks.
Okay.
So genuine counter-attack opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, the best way to train that, coach that, is using condition games for understanding. It gets all the players involved, forwards and backs working together. You can work on attack and defence at the same time. That's to say you're part of a coaching team and you've got 2 assistant coaches.
Mm-hmm.
You could say one's looking at one team, one's looking at the other, or one's looking at the attack principles, the other's looking at the defensive things you want to work on. And it challenge you as a coach to design games that allow player decision making and creativity. And so I believe you can have a big impact on not only individual performance but the whole team performance. So that's my favourite part, and the why really. It's a very important part of the game with so many tries coming from turnover ball.
Yeah. So how would that look if someone was watching a session and you were working on turnover ball?
Again, it's an area of my coaching I've developed specifically here in Chile the last 4 years, and the way I would design it, for example, I'd say to a team, you've got 3 rucks to score a try.
Yeah.
So if it got to the 3rd ruck, the opposition would know that, and the ruck allows that team to steal the ball. Or if they're kind of contesting it, it's like a bit more of a contact session. I'll just roll the ball to the scrum half, and straight away the other team attack. Another rule I might say is you have to box kick at the 2nd ruck. So you still got, the first phase and the first ruck to score a try. But if you get to a 2nd ruck, you have to box kick.
Yeah.
So you're therefore, you're working on your kick chase, you're getting kickbacks, or you receive the ball in the 15-metre channel and you have to kick it down the channel.
Right.
So, let's say you're in your own 22 or so, you would bomb it the length. If you're, say, around the halfway line, players would tend to rubber kick it down the channel. Mm-hmm. And obviously in other areas, players might chip kick it, or crossfield kick to completely the opposite side. There's so many options available. There's some of the 3 types of the conditioning games I would put in practice. And
yeah, great.
So that's like the terms and stuff. And what would it look like? In essence, utter chaos.
Yeah.
You got players everywhere. You got different formations. It's never the same scrum half.
Yeah.
Everyone's getting great games understanding of all the different roles and responsibilities. Everyone's active. We mentioned earlier about working on conditioning at the same time. You'd find lots of tries get scored just because players break down because they're fatigued and tired and not so fast, or they're slow on their decision making. And then from a coach's aspect, I'm saying very little. The only thing I'm saying is, in essence, I'm refereeing obviously the laws of the game and then the specific rules in the game. So if a team didn't, kick it on the 3rd ruck, I'll just kick the ball somewhere else and they play with that 2nd ball. Lots of encouragement one-on-one with guys, or as a team, great try, or, positive praise one-on-one with a player as he runs past you, just, give him a fist pump or a little word of encouragement.
Yeah.
So that's what it would look like.
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned earlier that, allowing players to break off into groups and brainstorm and problem solve, that would be a big feature as well.
Definitely. Once I set the very basic first rules up in that first set, I usually let them play between 5 minutes and 7 minutes. It depends on kind of where they're developed using, understanding the approach. And about 2.5 minutes in, kind of times in whenever a try gets scored, right? Pause, quick half time, you've got 30 seconds. The 2 teams would get in the player-led huddle. and they would facilitate what's working well. Okay, and what do we need to work on? And every now and again, you might notice it's kind of the same player talking all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say at the end of the 5-minute set, I kind of give them a little bit, say 2 minutes, 1 minute to 2 minutes, rather than short, sharp 30 seconds. And I would say to, okay, Jack, you can't talk.
Yeah.
So it helps the younger players, tend to be the younger players or the less experienced players. It gives them a chance to speak, rather than a dominant player always talking and kind of shutting down the other players. Or I would say, Johnny, you lead the circle. And quite often, again, that would be the quietest player in the team.
Yeah.
So with empowering that player to run the circle and letting a dominant player be quiet and just allow them to talk at the end in case what he's thinking hasn't been said, he'd then say it at the end. It's a balancing act that you need to judge with your, the experience of your players and what you're working on.
All right, great. Well, we always end the show with the same final 4 questions. When you were a kid growing up, who was one of your favourite players running around that got you really into the game?
It would have to be Tim Rodber, who was playing for Northampton Saints at the time. He was one of their captains, played for England, and he was part of the British Lions winning tour in South Africa in 1997. And got great presence on the field. Played in my position, my back row. And at the same time, during that period, I mentioned him earlier in the show, John Oliver was my PE teacher. He was the Saints captain, and he played for England at the time, and just great inspiration to be able to, back in those days, he'd join in our matches with us, we'd tackle him, we'd rock him out. That's
awesome.
We became his guinea pigs to keep him in shape and stuff. And I remember Monday morning, 9 o'clock PE lesson, 13 years old. He's been, playing at the weekend and doing what they did in the amateur days, and he'd make us do the bleep test twice. Yeah. Or we'd run around the reservoir because that's what he needed to do for his England training. So, both great inspirations for me, and, John's, the main reason why I'm doing what I'm doing now. So, great players for different reasons.
Ah, that's great. That's awesome. Okay, and what about now? Who's some of the players you like seeing play the game?
I kind of sit on the fence and kind of say various All Black players at the moment.
Yeah, who can't go wrong.
They're just almost like a different beast. In particular, Aaron Smith for me, proving that rugby's not all about brawn and size and power and stuff. It's about, speed of running, passing, decision making. I just think he's a great attribute to have in a team, and certainly in a 9 position.
Yeah, and I think I was watching a bunch of Super Rugby over the weekend, and just when you flick from one game to the other, and it's, say, you've been watching a South African or an Aussie team, and then you go to a New Zealand derby, it's just everything's 10% faster and 10% more clinical and 10% more physical. And I think there's a lot you can get out of that from a coaching point of view, or to watch the style of rugby that they play and some of the initiatives that they take.
And linking into the theme of this show, I don't think it's any surprise that they are so good, because they are a games-based coaching culture in New Zealand, and they're very player-centred. And empowerment is a big thing of the All Blacks and the Super Rugby sides, all the way down to the rep teams and the schools and clubs.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Okay, and on to coaches. Who's a high-profile coach that you really like the way they go about their business?
It's linked to, again, the influence he's had in my career. Brian Ashton, he's my coaching mentor, and to be able to FaceTime from here in Chile and just pick his brain or just ask his advice about things at different times. And the impact he had on the England team that helped win the World Cup.
Yeah.
It just coincided with me starting coaching, just seeing that victory in Australia. Sorry to mention that again.
I don't remember it.
It just coincided for me getting on that coaching path and then trying to work out why England were so successful. And Brian laid the foundations pre-World Cup. And then, as I say, I was lucky to learn firsthand from him. And then at the same time, Wayne Smith, the current All Blacks assistant coach, he's the reason I've been here in Chile for 4 years, just through going to one of his conferences in England, and he was in contact with the community I've coached in. And he shared with us why the Chiefs won the Super Rugby competition in 2012. And that's where I learned the try-scoring trends aspect, and going into that research and that detail of why tries are scored and conceded, it's had a major impact on then how I design my games, how I educate my players. So those two have been great influential coaches for me.
Yeah, you couldn't find two bigger names and more respected coaches in the business for sure. Okay, and the last question, who's someone in your local community in the grassroots who's digging away and doing great work?
I'd have to say a lad called Jack Moran. He's currently director of rugby at Dunstan College, who I now mentor.
Yeah.
But he was one of my old boys going through the school. He was a big part of our success, and he started to change that culture at Dunstan. And he got injured. I can't remember if it was playing rugby or maybe another sport, cricket maybe. He loves his cricket, and he can no longer play.
Yeah.
And so from a very young age of 18, he wanted to get into coaching. And
Oh, wow.
while I was away at university, he got stuck in with a local amateur club. Got involved in rep teams down south of England. At the same time, just knocked up his own sevens team that did some amateur tournaments around England in the summer.
That's great.
And then during his PGC, studying to become a teacher, he was at Durham and went along to the club and says, "I want to coach. I'll do whatever you want." And he coached one of their Busa teams, Bucks teams, for a season, and all that variety of experience now, he's putting it to the test and in an environment where he's in charge of a rugby program in a school setting, and he's a great kid.
That's great.
To learn, seeking out people, asking help, asking advice from me and stuff like that. So,
What was his name? Sorry, Jack Moran. You said.
Jack Moran, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you could look at that and say, "Oh, what a shame he had his playing career cut so short." But you could also look at it and say, "What an awesome opportunity! He's going to get a decade of coaching in before some people even start coaching. So he's going to be really well positioned." Yeah,
I would say he's light years ahead of his generation of coaches of that young. He's in his early 20s, mid 20s, and the amount he's learned in the last 5 years, it's mind blowing. It's
fantastic.
He's setting himself up for the future, which is great.
Yeah, agreed. All right then. Well, I just want to say thanks, Nick, for giving up your time to coming on the show and talking to us about not only the rugby landscape in Chile, but TGfU and ways that coaches can employ these strategies into their day-to-day sessions. I've gotten a huge amount out of it, and no doubt listeners have as well. So, yeah, once again, thank you very much.
No, thank you, Andy, and thanks for allowing the opportunity to have this chat online. And it's great to do this and share experiences and keep learning.
Yeah, no worries. Happy to do it. All right, cheers, mate.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the Rugby Coaches Corner podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please leave a review via iTunes and keep listening for the next episode. You can also follow us on Twitter at RugbyCoachSCNR or via the website at therugbycoachescorner.com. Until next time, keep sharing ideas to make the game better.